Welcome back. I'm thrilled to be joined by two men who raised their hand when so many else ran away. Since January 6th, we've learned that a lot of people are only in it either for the money, their own political fortunes, and not the right reasons. And to fix this fundamental asymmetry really is a human capital problem at the end of the day. We need people who say, send me. And so I'm joined today by Tom Kniff and Nick Smith, two men who stood up and jumped in the arena and made us all better for it. So let me have them tell their stories. Why don't you kick us off, Tom?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me, Mike, and thanks for that robust introduction. For those who don't know me, my name is Thomas Kniff, and I am a criminal defense attorney. I actually started my career, or very early in my career, I worked as an assistant district attorney as a prosecutor for the legendary Jeanine Pirro, who now, of course, is the U.S. attorney here in Washington, D.C. Spoke with her yesterday, actually. And after serving as a prosecutor and also serving on active duty as a U.S. Army JAG, continued to serve in reserve capacity up until just last year. I started a criminal defense firm of Razor & Kniff, now Razor, Kniff & Lonstein, with the other founding partner of the firm, Stephen Razor. And for the last 20 years, I've been representing people accused of criminal offenses, in the state, federal, and military justice system. I'm probably best known these days for successfully defending Daniel Penny, who was the subject of a unjust and weaponized prosecution by Alvin Bragg's office in Manhattan for subduing a violent, psychotic maniac who was trying to, threatening and attempting to harm innocent women and children and men on a uptown New York City subway train in May of 2023. I first got involved in the J6 cause, if you will, around the time that I started representing Daniel Penny. Cynthia Hughes, of course, who was the president of the Patriot Freedom Project. I had met her, and I was very attracted to the cause because it was very obvious to me, and I think so many others, that the January 6th defendants were being used as political pawns by the Biden administration, by the Democratic Party in general, to extract every bit of equity out of the events of January 6th to aid the Democrats in the midterm elections in 2022 and beyond. And it was very obvious to me that while I may not have liked every single thing that happened on January 6th, I don't think there is anyone who likes every single thing that happened on January 6th, that turning what was essentially a protest run amok into charges that the people were facing life sentences, people who were guilty of nothing more than perhaps trespassing being sentenced to years in federal prison, being held in pretrial detention, solitary confinement, was just absolutely anathema to everything that a civilized society and a civilized justice system should stand for. I currently represent approximately 50 January 6 defendants, my firm does, as plaintiffs, seeking to get them compensation for the violation of their constitutional and civil rights. Someone made a comment, Mike made a comment about attorneys who have profiteered off the January 6th defendants. I am not one of those. In fact, my firm is currently going substantially into hock, if you will, to keep these cases going, because we have not taken money from any January 6th defendant. We're doing this all on a contingency basis. Now, if that works out the way I think it should work out for the clients, that will hopefully compensate my firm for our outlays. But right now, we always have been, and we still are in it because we believe in the cause, not in a financial motivation.
So before I go to Nick, I just can't resist talking about that compensation angle because it's so critically important. The economics of being able to defend people. And when we talk about restitution for the January 6ers and other victims of weaponization, that is the correction the system needs. To make people whole and for the government to admit fault is the only way you ever meaningfully inhibit the ability of this to happen in the future. When the government has to pay out those sums and to make these people who have their constitutional rights abused and trampled on, that is the check that needs to happen. While the pardons for all the January 6ers were a terrific act of political courage by President Trump, that is the next step that I think is ultimately required. And to that end, I'm so glad that you're pushing for it. The Oversight Project sent a very long letter to the Department of Justice laying out the legal and prudential case for giving restitutions to those individuals. And so we want to be as absolutely helpful in that regard as possible, because until the system has to pay up for the harms that it did, under the fundamental premise is that your government shouldn't be harming you, and if they do, they should make you whole. I don't think we have, really achieved much in the way of accountability. So I'm thrilled you're doing that.
No, and I appreciate everything you and your organization is doing, Mike, because yes, we must, the demand for compensation. And by the way, none of these people could ever truly be compensated.
Right.
Okay. You could put as many zeros on the end of a check as you want. No one's going to trade that check, for, or you say, hey, look, you can spend 3 years in the DC gulag in solitary. What's your number? There is no number. Okay. There's no amount of money that a reasonable person would accept to deal with what these folks dealt with. But you can certainly help them to rebuild their lives, hopefully try to partially compensate them for what they went through. But the psychological, the emotional damage, the family separation, everything else, no amount of money can cure that. But it's the best that the government can do, unless you can turn back time, which of course we can. But the demands, it's one thing. You got lawyers like myself, Nick, a lot of great lawyers involved in the organization now, advocating for January 6ers, or have been involved. We might not be having this sort of panel if not for the great work that Nick was able to do on the 1512, right? But it needs to be a groundswell from people who are not just the attorneys, organizations like yours and beyond, because frankly, as much as I support the Trump administration, the great people he has in his administration, it has been too slow. It's been too quiet, and things need to come to a head, because these folks have waited long enough. They shouldn't have had to wait this long.
That's absolutely right. I think a lot of people in the political class just want it to be over, but it's never going to be over until we solve for it.
Yeah.
Nick, over to you. You're the architect of so many massive victories and important parts in here, whether it's 1512 or your other work. Why don't you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I want to focus on the silver lining in the cloud here for January 6th a little bit, because we've been fulminating about the abuses, and there are many of them. But the silver lining here was really Patriot Freedom Project and Cynthia Hughes, and I want to explain why. We talked about how there was 1,500 protesters who were charged more than that on January 6th, and they had two options. They can either come up with about $100,000 or more for sophisticated defense counsel, or they can use public defenders. Now, I'm not going to knock the public defender's office. They're often extremely competent and excellent lawyers, but there was a twist here, which is the politics. So even for the best of lawyers, it's difficult for them to separate out in their heads their priors and their political background from their profession. And what I saw over and over again was protesters telling me, I've talked to my defender and they're saying you're an insurrectionist. Okay, that's a crime. That's a very serious crime, and they hadn't even been charged with these things. So are you going to be represented zealously in court by a person telling you you've already committed a crime that you're not even charged with? So what do? They could then sell their family home. They could get a second mortgage. They could sell their car. They could mortgage their children's futures. They couldn't do that either. So what Patriot Freedom Project did was it stepped into this breach, and it used its network, its Rolodex of good, decent, qualified lawyers. I won't name all of them here. Some of them are in government now. And it put the lawyers in touch with these defendants who were getting zealous representation by public defenders. And so there was no other organization doing this. I want to stress that, none. So it's not just, Mike, you've really eloquently pointed out how few people stepped up to the plate, lawyers, to defend these people. But it was also organizations. There were so few organizations that were fundraising for them. And Cynthia deserves an enormous, deserves our gratitude for all the work that they did for these defendants.
Here, here.
And I'll just dovetail on this. I've seen some chatter online that the attorneys that charged the January 6th defendants all this money and so forth. And look, I did not represent any January 6ers in their criminal cases. I came close, but it just didn't happen. But I would, anyone who is serious should block out that noise. Because it is the amount of work that very close with some attorneys, beyond Nick, that took those cases. And $100,000, look, it's a lot of money to you, it's a lot of money to me, it is a lot of money, but the amount of work that goes into getting a competent defense, and there were some extraordinary lawyers representing these folks. $100,000 is not a lot of money in terms of legal fees and the cost to defend cases like this. I mean, I am routinely, when I do criminal defense cases in federal court in Southern Eastern District, particularly white collar cases, or any kind of case that's sort of just the volume of evidence in the January 6 cases, the amount of video and so forth, let alone the tyrannical prosecutions you were up against. It's funny, you occasionally have co-counsel from these white shoe Wall Street corporate firms, and you think, Razor, Kniff, and Lonstein are billing, there's a good case, we're making a good fee on this, and then you get an idea of what they're billing, and you're like,
Yep.
I'm working for chump change. So, any attorney who, stepped up and took one of these cases, and by the way, at that time, particularly at that time, at great personal risk to their own profession, their own career, very hard to charge too much for that type of case. It's important to keep that in mind. For attorney of Nick's stature, Jonathan Crisp was someone I was very close with. I served in the military, who handled a lot of cases. $50,000, $75,000, $100,000 fee. Trust me, none of those attorneys were getting wealthy or living well off that sort of fee, given the amount of work that was involved in defending these cases and the climate that they took place in.
That's absolutely right. At the end of the day, it's an industry, and people need to be able to build and have reasonable expectations around it. But that's a far cry of a difference from some of the actual profiteering that we've seen occur over various aspects of weaponization. But I want to drill into the asymmetries of why this is a problem for these victims of weaponization, but it's never a problem for the left's darlings.
No, of course not.
I saw Maduro got a lawyer pretty quickly. He might have all this money, but it's not frozen.
Maduro, not only did he have a lawyer, but I had, inside knowledge from folks in the courthouse that there were other, I won't name names, but of the, most prominent members of the private criminal defense bar that are currently representing some of the most prominent defendants, names we would all know in a second, that were kind of buzzing around the courtroom because everyone knows that there's going to be an unlimited pipeline of money there, whether it is through crowdfunding that, you look at the money that's been raised by the kid with the eyebrows who shot the CEO.
Mangione.
Mangione. Yeah, sorry. I'm blanking on the name. My wife always refers to him as the one with the eyebrows. The limitless pot of gold that is available for attorneys taking that case, and hey, that's fine. That's capitalism, I guess, even though it's on behalf of a so-communist from these far left groups. They can name their fee.
What about the pro bono work, though? Also, it's obviously Maduro, if endless money, you're completely right. But whenever anybody who represents anything considerably left-wing, even if they have no resources, they're going to get the best pro bono counsel or have these legal foundations paying for counsel. Can you guys give me a little more color on the asymmetry of what's available on the other side?
Well, here's an example of the asymmetry. So the largest firms in the country that you're referring to not only were not doing defense side pro bono work, which is classically what it's about representing indigent defendants, they were suing them. they were suing the January 6th defendants at the same time that they were being prosecuted for virtually the exact same conduct. So that was considered pro bono work for some of these large law firms. And it was totally crushing these protesters and their families. In fact, they're still dealing with the fallout today. So I think that's the first time I had ever heard of pro bono work in suing, adding a parallel civil lawsuit on top of the criminal exposure of the person.
Yeah, Nick's absolutely right. I mean, if you look at these big, what in the industry refer to as the white shoe firms, 1,000 lawyer firms where the partners bill at $3,000 an hour, maybe probably more now. That's not my world, unfortunately. I've, through the years, back when I used to do indigent defense, represent somebody who's, convicted of homicide. And next thing you know, they're, the appeals being handled by, Sullivan and Cromwell, or, these pro bono, right? So they're willing, and everybody's entitled to a defense, everyone's entitled to an appeal, regardless of whether you're factually guilty, legally guilty, both. You've been convicted, so I applaud those firms for taking on those cases. But the irony of, hey, you're willing to represent someone who's convicted of murder in the second degree, but you would never go away anywhere near defending someone who's convicted of or guilty of a simple trespass because of the politics.
Yep. That's right. And as we look at, potential areas for reform, with obviously restitution being chief amongst them, another one to remember is we're about a year out from the President Trump's executive orders as they related to big law firms. A couple took deals, a couple changed behavior, allegedly because of the potential of deals. But a year out, and we have a paper coming out on this report because we basically followed up with every single law firm. I haven't seen a change in the legal culture at big law whatsoever. In fact, it seems many of these firms that were targeted now are in court and opposed to many things on President Trump's agenda. What are you guys seeing about any shifts since President Trump came into office in the big firm life?
I mean, again, I'm not immersed in that world, but I don't think there's been any shift. I think that, look, those firms are about dollars and cents. Okay, I mean, you could argue every private law firm, if you're not about that, then, or at least that's not part of what you're doing, you're not going to be in business long. Right. So they may have puckered their lips and held their nose and kissed the ring, but those were business decisions, and they weren't cultural shifts. Yeah. The minute that Trump is out of office, or if we do wind up having a Democratic administration in 2028, which obviously we hope is not the case, that's all going away. Yeah. Okay, so that's them using their survival instincts and doing what they have to do. I mean, it's nice, but it is fleeting. It's temporary. It's superficial, in my opinion.
Yeah, we need to start searching for equal and opposite reactions, at least. I mean, when we look at the scale of what happened over the previous 4 years in the Biden administration, how much damage is caused, we should be thinking in terms of permanent fixes to those things.
So that's exactly
proportional
right.
fixes.
You need structural changes.
Yep.
Putting in someone like Janine Pirro in Washington D.C. Great. Some of the other U.S. attorney spots. I was with John Sarcone last night, who's up in Albany. Unfortunately, can't get confirmed because the judges there are trying to, or have, kneecapped him the way they did with Ilana Haba and so forth. All that's great, but it's all fleeting because it changes the moment the politics change. So if you're really trying to deal with weaponization, how to stop it from happening again to either side, because no one should be the subject of a weaponized government, Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative, but you need to make changes that are structural, that are going to endure regardless of who's in the White House or who's in Congress.
That's absolutely true, and you'll never do that until there's complete political control, at least for the next few years, over the Department of Justice, and there's not now. Only about 1/3 of the U.S. attorneys are filled because the Senate is relying on this blue slip tradition. And so if you're a U.S. attorney nominee from a state with a Democrat senator, you got 0% chance of getting through. It's
absolutely. And then if you talk to the U.S. attorneys, and once again,
yep,
no attribution, not naming names, but I've spoken with several of them privately, and they're there, but they can't. Their staff is still polluted.
Yes,
with
I like that term.
Generations of,
Right.
ideologically, I have no problem, I don't care what a prosecutor's political affiliation is, but these are ideologically driven people that occupy those positions. So who can the U.S. attorney trust? Who can they rely on? How can they fill positions even when they have vacancies? Because a job, frankly, doesn't pay very well, despite requiring high qualifications. And for instance, in Washington D.C., where is your pool of conservative-minded Republican lawyers for the U.S. attorney in Washington D.C. to pull from? Okay, they could say, all right, well, maybe if you expand the search beyond Washington D.C., but now you're asking someone to come from some other state, some other city, uproot their life and move to Washington D.C., where they probably or very likely have a family, own a home, have kids, for by the way, a job that's not going to pay any more than it pays anywhere else. And if you adjust for the cost of living in D.C., you're actually probably making far less in real dollars.
That's absolutely right. And Nick, I want to get into the meat and potatoes weaponizations, but I want to make an addendum. Earlier, I was decrying the lack of a conservative legal movement, and that's not the right term. It's what these legacy institutions and graybeards in there like to call it, because they take some pride in what they think is a progression of victories, which is actually a progression of failures. What I mean when I say we need a legal movement, whatever the term should be, is really not even like ideological or political.
Right.
Frankly, I don't know what your guys' politics truly are, and nor do I care. When I use this term, like conservative, what I truly mean is like, there is a constitution that affords people rights.
Yeah.
And the judicial system and law enforcement should be the neutral arbiters of those rights. Everyone should get the fair shake. Weaponization should not be the selection of targets based on their politics or where they fit in the culture, and then applying like statutes and other things and other tactics to hurt them and to achieve ends that are outside the legal system, that are better left to the political and social systems. That's like first principles level stuff. That's the legal movement I want. I don't care if what its views on marginal tax rates are or anything else. And I think that's what we're missing and where the asymmetry comes from. But like, let's lean into this a little bit more about, and Nick, you and I have spoken about this quite a bit. Like, what is weaponization? How do you define it? What are the tactics?
Mike, I think you just put it so well. And if you're going to add a tagline to it, it's depoliticized, a depoliticized legal bar that makes a good faith effort to put politics out of their mind, especially in the criminal justice system. And it sounds like something that you can just snap your fingers and do, but it takes an earnest effort. You have to want it. And I think that's the bar that we're looking for. And weaponization is the opposite of that. Weaponization is starting with someone's background, starting with what they say online, starting with their speech, and then looking for a crime that fits their conduct to prosecute them. The Doug Mackey case is the best, is the poster child example of this. And if those prosecutors had been earnest with themselves about whether politics was playing a role, they couldn't have said it, denied it. They could not have. So that's what weaponization is. Weaponization is taking a vague statute and prosecuting conduct that is typically related to speech, is related to politics. It's and it's very dangerous.
Yes. And to follow up with you, Tom, let me ask you this question in a really simple way.
Right.
Why do you think they prosecuted up in New York your client, Daniel Penny?
Well, in that particular case, what happened was the district attorney's office caved to political pressure. My first conversations with the then assigned assistant district attorney, who I had dealings with, and is a good lawyer and a pretty reasonable guy. I could tell you that I don't think he loved the case, and I think that he saw the situation, at the very least, as being nuanced. And there were a lot of people in that district attorney's office who I know from firsthand conversations didn't think that case should be prosecuted. My initial conversations were, hey, we're going to take a slow, pragmatic approach to this. We want to go to do a protracted investigation. This is in early May, by the way, and maybe if we're going to go into the grand jury, it's not going to be probably not until sometime in mid-June. But in the meantime, we want to really kind of work through this. Okay, then what happened is, and keep in mind, 2023, early 2023, was a different time than 2024, 2025. We've sort of I think as a country now kind of look back on BLM and look back on the whole George Floyd thing, and even, sort of middle of the road people or middle of the road Democrats are like, okay, everybody got caught up a little bit in the hysteria.
Maybe we shouldn't have burned a large part of the country.
Yeah,
maybe it's a slight overreaction.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, maybe
particularly when
a
compared to
overreaction.
January 6th.
Right.
I mean, the dollars and cents
yeah.
there just aren't even in the same ballpark.
But all that stuff was much more raw, and we haven't, as a society, I don't think we had that inflection point at that time. So with the Daniel Penny situation, as more and more came out, and then it came out that he was a Marine, that he was white, that he was from Long Island, which, believe it or not, in, New York City, Long Island, Manhattan, Long Island is viewed as, Republican, as white, as, all sorts of connotations. And the Marines are the Marines, right? So the protesters then, like the day after that phone call, wind up on the tracks. They shut down the subway station. Al Sharpton is being Al Sharpton, along with, that whole narrative. And you have Alvin Bragg, who was elected on, his agenda of, racial justice and so on and so forth. And I wound up getting a call like 36 hours later from the same prosecutor, and you could tell that he was kind of sheepish and probably embarrassed, and said, look, I know our conversation we've had, but this is coming from the executive office, and I need your client to surrender tomorrow for arrest and arraignment. And what am I going to say? No. And it went from there. So in that case, you clearly had a prosecutor's office that bended really within 24 hours to the political pressure that was calling for my client's scalp. And that came, by the way, we talk about people like Al Sharpton, it came from right down the political line, including the governor of the state. So the governor of the state went on television and said, Kathy Hochul, you can't put your arm around someone's neck and squeeze it until they die, right? So how do you compete with that?
Mm-hmm. These are my words, not yours, but he was charged because he was white. And he would not have been charged if he was not, because it fit a preferred rhetoric about the narrative of race relations in the United States. It's unconscionable. That is no place in our legal system, and there should be severe consequences for the violations of anyone's civil rights on the basis of race.
Well, I agree, but don't tell the district attorney that, including the prosecutor who actually wound up trying the case, who was a zealot, who was not reasonable, who was not anything like the first individual, whose name I won't name. She was a true believer, and the amount of race baiting that was injected. She may have thought it was innocuously, but it was very obvious, right from jury selection to opening statements to summation. It was blatant, and it was really awful to see. I am a former prosecutor. I am not an ideologue. I'm not a zealot. I believe that most line prosecutors, are not out there to railroad people for the sake of railroading them. I think that they wind up getting involved in weaponization. They probably don't even see it as weaponization or realize what they're involved in. But this was, very deliberate. I had been litigating against the Manhattan DA's office for 20 years. And I'd never seen anything like this, and frankly, I hope never to see anything like it again.
I hope so as well, and I think there needs to be consequences and making people whole if we truly want to prevent it from happening again, or at least mitigate the probability. Nick, we only got a couple minutes left, too. Take us home with your final thoughts and close us out.
My final thoughts are, I hope we learned something from this whole experience on January 6th. It gave me a lot of gray hair. I saw families broken apart. I saw a lot of young children suffer from their parents' absence. Being in court and in trial in front of DC juries in these cases was not fun. It was not a pleasant experience, and when I think back on it, it's stressful. But I hope we learned something, and I hope that lesson is getting politics out of criminal law. I think that's what Weaponization Watch is about.
Gentlemen, well said. Thanks for being here. Thanks to Cynthia and Patriot Freedom Project for organizing all of us, and looking forward to more great work.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks, Mike. This was great.